I call Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in support of this Wellington Town Belt Bill in its third reading. And I will commend the sponsoring members' efforts in this. But today, as been mentioned earlier, Mr Speaker, is May the 4th. And may this day always be with us. It is also known to the many fans as Star Wars Day. I think, in a sense, because this is a very serious and important debate, the lead up to it was somewhat quite interesting, because as I watched some of it on television and some of it in this chamber, there were a few references to Star Wars days going around. A colleague on my side was suggesting that the Leader of the Opposition was Palpatine, some evil emperor. I think he was trying to portray the persona of a young Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then Mr Tabato was also making certain references which I couldn't quite make out, but I am a Star Wars fan, Mr Speaker, and the character that sprung to mind for me was Jar Jar Binks. But we move on to the Wellington Town Belt Bill, and I would like to commend Grant Robertson for his exemplary, excellent work and commitment to seeing this local bill introduced and passing through the House with unanimous support. Mr Robertson raised the Town Belt in his maiden speech, and it has not only been stuck with him as words in his speech, but as actions that he was clearly committed to doing something about. And along with commending his resolution dedication to this, I will also acknowledge the elected councillors and mayor and the officials of Wellington City Council for their perseverance and also, quite frankly, their willingness to compromise and accept that a bill that strengthens the Wellington Town Belt Bill and protects it for all of Wellington is better to have a bill that passes through the House than to spend more years arguing perhaps from an ideological basis in some sense of pure vision, but one which might not receive sufficient support in the House to be passed. So here we are at this point, and the bill was only introduced into the House a few short months ago. While it's taken a long time for it to come to the House, it has gone through the proceedings of the House in fairly short order, and here we are this evening, I think all very, very confident that this bill will be passed in this third reading unanimously. Just as we work through this, I mean, it's important, I think, also to give some consideration as to how and why this belt is so important to Wellingtonians. Has been mentioned, it is a horseshoe-shaped ring that basically harnesses, so it frames the city around from Mount Victoria, around through, as has been mentioned, to Te Ahu Mairangi Hill, which ends at the edge of the Ohario electorate. In a very real sense, it frames the city. And you could say, like a belt, it harnesses, in many respects, the good qualities and the energy of this fine city, particularly as we seek to project ourselves into the globe, as we are building upon our creative industries, our ICT, as well as our traditional light manufacturing and primary industries, as Wellington seeks to retain its status as a thriving, vibrant and growing powerhouse within New Zealand. We have this belt which helps to showcase our city. And I think, Mr Speaker, it's actually a quality, a characteristic of the city that the inhabitants, both long-term and perhaps more transitory, actually see real value in. And that brings us to why we've reached this point today, why Wellingtonians would see it as so important and worthwhile to protect it into the future. Because its status has never perhaps been quite as certain as members and inhabitants would have liked. As has been pointed out by members in the debate so far, it actually started off as a larger holding than it is today, in excess of 500 hectares. But today, roughly around about 400 hectares. So there have been points in its history where, despite the trust deeds, despite the nature where it was first gifted, that the land within the town belt has not always been so sacrosanct to the city or to the governance within the city that it might not be paired off for other purposes. But what this bill will ensure that not only are the 400 hectares that comprise the belt today protected, but as members have pointed out, both Grant himself, the Honourable King, my colleague Paul Foster-Bell, as they have pointed out, this bill gives the ability for the council to add to the town belt. And approximately around 120, 130 additional hectares of land will be added to the belt following the passing of this bill. So not only does it give the inhabitants of Wellington absolute certainty as to the protection and status of their town belt, but it actually doesn't prevent the town belt from expanding in time as ways that might be appropriate to the inhabitants of Wellington, expressed through their elected officials, the mayor and councillors of the city. But I think the value of the town belt is more than a simple visual pleasure or a continuance of a green space in Wellington. It is actually used for a number of worthwhile activities, one of which, and in fact is its own one of the uses of the town belt, is a sport and rec facility. So for many, many years there has been a velodrome in the Haitaitai section of the town belt. But there's also home to a Wellington rugby club, and particularly from my personal perspective, Mr. Speaker, my daughter plays netball at the netball facilities at Haitaitai Park very regularly through each winter, and not alone. Many, many hundreds of Wellingtonian children playing netball in that fine facility. It provides a space for many teams to play simultaneously on separate courts. I'm afraid not all members quite understood that very clear reference, but happy to educate them and help their understanding a little. One does understand on this side of the house they are often in much need of that. So however, the town belt itself is used for many, many good purposes for Wellington residents, sport being one of them. So I think it's important, and it is actually important, Mr. Speaker, the ability to do not only those particular activities, but activities which the inhabitants of Wellington would deem worthy. It was very important that they were protected. Because throughout this process, as people have pointed out, there were about 300 submissions to council. There were 31 made to the select committee here, of which about, I think, 21 or so were heard in person. Amongst those submitters, because some certainly came to see me, there were people with very well-intentioned motives, but whose, if their particular wants had been translated into the bill, might actually have prevented some of these activities, which, as I've said, the inhabitants of Wellington value within the town belt, may have seen those curtailed, if not completely removed. They really wanted an absolute pure green space. But what the bill is going to do, as it does pass into legislation following this reading, is it's going to protect the power for the council to grant either leases or, most likely, as they have expressed themselves, licences for activities to occur, including some commercial activities on the belt. For instance, in that sporting facilities that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, parents, most often parents, while they're watching their children play sport, are now able to actually go to the cafeteria, get a coffee, get some food, healthy food I might add too, and enjoy that while they're watching their children play sport. Their ability to do that is actually because the council can offer licences, more likely licences than leases, but can offer the ability for operators to provide certain services on the town belt. And if some submitters, if their wants had been expressed in the legislation, that may, in fact, would have been curtailed. That wouldn't necessarily be the best thing for Wellington. And I think that actually brings us to the heart of what is most important about this bill, not in terms of necessarily the text of the bill, but what it is seeking to achieve, and I believe we all agree it will achieve. And that is that it's going to protect a green space for the inhabitants of Wellington, that they will get to choose what that space will be used for over its lifetime. Through their elected officials, through the council, through the officials within the council, the will of Wellingtonians as to the green space that can be protected in their environment, how it can be added to, how it can be used as an amenity for the value of the citizens, the inhabitants of Wellington. This bill protects that. I think it's an important, incredibly important piece of legislation for the city and its environs. I think the value of it stretches beyond just the inhabitants within the city council area, but to also people in the Hutt Valley, to Porirua, even to the Kapiti Coast, to the region as a whole. Mr. Speaker, it is an absolute privilege to stand in the House and speak on this third reading, and I commend this bill to the House.